African Mirror. This time of the show, this time of the week, we have a look at Matters Africa. And this is an interesting one today. The African Union is continuing its pursuit of establishing the Africa Credit Rating Agency, or ACRA for short, with the African Union arguing that the organization would assist in providing greater transparency to investors, thus countering financial misconceptions that have, according to the United Nations Development Program, cost the continent over $20 billion in potential investments. This certainly is good news, and I'm certainly holding thumbs and everything else that this does bear fruit, because we need it. Online is Dr. Paul Kariuki, Executive Director of the Democracy Development Program at the University of KZN and convener at the Africa Policy Circle. Dr. Paul Kariuki, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Shafiq, for having me on the show, and good afternoon to your listeners.
This is a big one, and I'm sure a lot of us were wondering when this was going to happen, when the African Union would try and institute its own credit rating agency, because how many African countries right now are on the bad end of all of Fitch and Poor's and all of these rating agencies who consistently put us into grey and junk status?
And thank you, because that's actually the background that has produced this kind of initiative, because there's been an outcry from most African countries that the international rating agencies have not been doing a fair assessment of our economies on the continent, and they have been, relying on information that's perceived by many of the African countries not to be factual. Last year and the year before last year, there was some perception that they are just hiring consultants to do desktop research and who come up with all kinds of assessments that are not really consistent with the on-ground situation in most African countries. So from that point of view, there has been a drive towards having an African-owned credit agency, which really takes into account the continental circumstances for each country, and with a perception that there will be more of a fair assessment of the in-country conditions that are not going to jeopardize, any national development plans and engagements or on other different fronts that will promote the local economies. So from that point of view, I think there is an agreement. It's a positive initiative, but of course it presents itself some challenges that needs to be considered to make it workable and achieve the goals that it has been, set for.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with your perception. It's a perception held outside of the interview that a lot of the assessments are desk-based, I'll put it that way, and the analyst doesn't even get their feet dusty walking outside the office and looking at what happens in Africa. Would you agree that it's important that people get out there and start looking at the continent firsthand, because often what's criticized is a result or a system, yet if you get on the ground, it is often a very different scenario. You find that microeconomies are flourishing, but for some reason the macroeconomy isn't, and that never comes through the data.
I agree with you 100%. There is no way someone sitting outside of the continent can rely on information that is available online and make a judgment that has a detrimental effect on millions of people, if you think about it. And so the first line of credibility and integrity in assessment is that whosoever is tasked with the responsibility of coming up with a report that may affect the trajectory of an entire nation must be on ground to collect first-hand information, engage broadly with all kinds of stakeholders to form a picture that can inform an opinion. So for an international agency to sit somewhere across outside of the continent and come up with a decision that does not meet the expectations of the countries is already flawed. Having said so, knowing that now with this kind of an agency, even though we are celebrating it's an African-owned, it must not repeat the mistakes of the international agencies. In other words, it needs to be staffed properly with credible, competent human resource that is able to collect data from different countries to make an opinion that is informed by evidence, so that it's also not going to go again in the same route that the international agencies have gone through. Secondly, it has to be strengthened politically. In other words, member states must give it the impetus it needs, so that also that when that team goes into a particular country to collect data, it's also not met with a backlash from the political leadership of those countries, because it's possible. These kind of exercises are very emotive and very politically hot, if I put it that way, because it's delving into information that probably is not publicly available, classified information, but it's needed to be accessed so that a fair assessment is done. So it's important that also member states give the political will that is needed for such a credit agency to be able to do its work properly. And the third point I would like to mention there in passing is a whole governance structure. It has to be independent. It cannot be an agency that is going to be influenced by external political elite to form a particular opinion of a particular nation because of an ulterior motive that is not known. So in terms of governance, it must be governed in a way that it will also increase confidence among African citizenry, that is actually a reliable institution that is independent of any political agenda.
I would also like the Africa Credit Rating Agency to have room to make suggestions to various African economies through a less neoliberal lens, as it were, through a more socially sympathetic lens in terms of how to grow their economies, where to trade, etc., etc. Do you think that should be a necessary add-on, or that should be a sort of an aim of the Africa Credit Rating Agency, that it can actually have the license to give a suggestion to an African economy how it can improve itself?
I think that's a very important objective point that should be actually in the forefront of those who are leading the initiative, since it's going to be effective from June this year, as I'm told. It needs to be seen to be an instrument to facilitate economic development in the truest sense in African countries. Remember, if assessments will be done to support a neoliberal position in a continent where we have high levels of economic inequalities, majority of African people are still disenfranchised. Majority of them are still questioning what does their independence from the colonials still mean. And to some countries, we are talking over 50, 60 plus years post-independence. It cannot be correct that such an assessment will also be influenced by neoliberal ideologies that will continue to emphasize, flight of capital and control of local economies by external actors. It cannot be fair. So I agree with you. One of the objectives of this assessment of credit agency should be looking at how do they promote intra-Africa trading, for example, and exploring the opportunities that ACFTA, for example, has been trying to get through, so that this agency actually assesses countries' abilities to trade with each other, number one, and also to look at how can the economies of the African countries, even at a regional level, can interlink with each other. What are the capacities that are available? Where are their shortcomings? What can be done to address the shortcomings to facilitate intra-African trading? If it goes that direction, that means then the agency is helping the overall continental picture of creating an Africa we want. And we want to see an agency that is able to sympathize with the challenges that the continent is experiencing at the individual country level, and facilitating a fair assessment that is also helpful for the countries themselves, but also for the broader policy-making process at the African Union level, so that now our development agenda is aligned with in-country conditions, but also aligned to the regional economic communities on how they can support each other. We haven't arrived there yet, but it's an ideal that we need to go there as a continent, and I hope that the agency will be sympathetic to those kind of ideals rather than to focus on already what has been existing, which is ideological position from the liberal markets that has left most of Africans poorer than they were found when those initiatives started in the first place.
100%, and unfortunately we have to leave it there. African Mirror. Today we were discussing the African Union pursuing the establishing of the Africa Credit Rating Agency that has the potential of unleashing $20 billion in potential investment in the continent using a less neoliberal model of understanding our economies. Online, as always, our special guest has been Dr. Paul Kariuki, Executive Director of the Democracy Development Program at the University of KZN and convener at the Africa Policy Circle.